Oh, hey all, grab yourself a beer, it's time for some Path of Exile discussion. Today I wanted to talk about a unique item, continuing a series of discussing in-game unique items. But this time we're going to be talking about a slightly different one. A lot of the other ones have been extreme chase items that are quite difficult to get your hands on and very hard to source in solo self-found. This is very different. This is one of the most deterministically farmable items in the game. It's also something that is a very common item to see used all the way through to extreme endgame content. And this is Atziri's Promise. Atziri's Promise is a unique flask that drops from a boss that you can gain access to before you leave white maps. Although Atziri, Queen of the Vaal, is considerably harder than a tier 5 map boss or even a tier 5 Conqueror of the Atlas, she's not massively harder, and she's a fight that you can learn pretty easily and get pretty good at and get on farm. Additionally, Atziri's Promise has a 50% drop rate from this fight, so that's massive. So why is this item good? Essentially, this item is transformative of the way that players see flasks. During the storyline content, during the acts, you tend to think of flasks as being all about recovering life, recovering mana, and potentially increasing your movement speed through a Quicksilver Flask. Then, and perhaps also removing status elements. Then you get to endgame and you have options of flasks, particularly unique flasks, that tremendously ramp up your damage. And Atziri's Promise is one of these. So, Atziri's Promise is an Amethyst Flask. Arguably one of the two weakest types of utility flasks. Amethyst flasks provide 35% chaos resistance. This is okay, I mean, you'll take it, but it's far from a powerhouse effect like the powerhouse effect of a Quicksilver Flask with its 40% increased movement speed. Additionally, the flask requires level 68. So you can't use it, pretty much can't use it during the storyline at all, and for veteran players you can't use it in early maps if you're able to source it, because you're probably getting to maps around level 64 as a veteran. Now, 3 lines of text on this. Firstly is 2% of chaos damage leached as life during flask effect. This is okay, but this is a small bonus. The real power of the item is in the other 2 lines. The first line, gain 20% of physical damage added as extra chaos damage during effect. Now this is a variable roll. A worst case roll would be 15%, a best case roll is 20%, as you see here. And this is, generally speaking, in a trade league, not the roll that people care about the most on this item. This will provide builds that scale physical damage in order to inflict poisons on enemies with a massive damage boost. It will also provide a modest damage boost to builds that scale physical damage, but that do not use Brutality Support. If you're using Brutality Support, this will provide no benefit to you. The third and final line is gain 10 to 15% of elemental damage added as extra chaos damage during effect. Now, again, the higher the roll on this, the better. This is the roll in a trade league that tends to matter. If you get a roll that is 15% on the elemental damage as extra chaos, then your flask is going to be worth something on the first few days of a league. So if you don't care about that roll and you're in a trade league, you might want to consider trading it off, picking up a cheaper version that has the perfect roll for physical added as chaos, and save some currency or build yourself some currency that way. Later in the league, because this item is so common, the fact that 1 in 6 of them will have a perfect 15% elemental as added as extra chaos roll means that the trade league market will be flooded with them anyway. So, what is the absolute best way to build around Atziri's Promise? What you want is a sort of build that uses a skill that starts out dealing physical damage and then converts it into other elements. There is an interesting and somewhat broken in some ways interaction where a skill like the Penance Brand that you see here that deals its damage as physical damage first, then 50% by default, but 100% with my character's setup, is converted to lightning damage. Then 96% of that is converted to cold damage due to other items that I'm wearing. Then 50% of that is converted to fire damage. All of these extra layers of conversion then interact in the most favourable way imaginable with Atziri's Promise. So the way that it works is that if I dealt 100 physical damage to begin with, I would receive the 20% of physical added as extra chaos damage. Then that 100 physical damage would all be converted into lightning damage, and that would be 100 lightning damage. I would then receive another another 20%, sorry, another 14% of that lightning damage. So another 14 chaos damage from the lightning damage. Then I'd be dealing 96 points of cold damage due to my conversion from lightning into cold, which is using a much more expensive item, Call of the Brotherhood. This would then cause me to gain 14% of this 96 cold damage. So I would, although I'm only dealing 4 lightning damage and 96 cold damage at this point, I'm actually getting 20% of the 100 physical damage and 14% of the 100 lightning damage and 14% of the 96 cold damage. Then I'll add on to that I'm dealing 48 48 fire damage, and I'm getting another 14% of that. Essentially saying that Atziri's Promise gets multiple times the benefit if you're playing a skill that converts damage like that. However, Atziri's Promise is pretty solid on its own as well. You don't need to be using conversion shenanigans. My advice to you is that you pick up a copy of Atziri's Promise unless you are incapable of dealing chaos damage. The ways in which you become incapable of dealing chaos damage are if your primary skill is linked to Brutality Support, or if you have a source of Avatar of Fire on your character. Avatar of Fire comes from one node on the passive tree, which is unsurprisingly called Avatar of Fire, and it has the text, deal no non-fire damage. It's also found on the very powerful endgame amulet Zoph's Blood. So don't use Atziri's Flask in conjunction with either of those. So how do you get this item? Firstly, it has a 50% drop rate from Atziri, the Queen of the Vaal. Now, you will have been picking up these Sacrifice at Dusk, Sacrifice at Noon, Sacrifice at Dawn, and the rarer Sacrifice at Midnight fragments while you've been mapping, while you've been leveling. What you'll need to do is put a full set of 4 of them into the map device at once, and that will open up a portal into the Apex of Sacrifice, which is Atziri's Zone. Atziri Zone contains 3 boss encounters as well as a whole bunch of magic monsters. The boss encounters are mechanically tricky. The first one will be familiar. It's the boss of Act 2, but don't be fooled, there's 2 of them at once, and additionally they move faster, and once one of them dies, the other one becomes enraged. The second boss fight is a fight against a trio of bosses that have some devastating attacks. And I actually have a guide to the Vaal Temple boss because the fight is the same as the Vaal Temple boss. It's easier in the Apex of Sacrifice though. Then when you get to Atziri herself, she has a number of quite scary moves. And actually, I've never made a guide for Atziri. Maybe I should do that at some point. The key thing is that you only need to do the normal version of the Atziri encounter. You don't need to do the much harder version that is gated behind these mortal fragments. So a set of Mortal Grief, Mortal Rage, Mortal Ignorance, and Mortal Hope lets you fight a harder version of the Atziri encounter that has different loot, but you don't need to do that hard mode in order to get Atziri's Promise. You just need to do it normally. Lastly, if you are using this item, firstly, if you're in a trade league, trade for one that has a perfect role in whichever of the 2 components you care about. So if you are a physical spellcaster that is inflicting poisons on enemies, you want to have gained 20% of physical damage as extra chaos damage during effect. If you are an elemental caster that is using this for a bit of extra damage, then you want 15% of elemental damage added as extra chaos. And if you are a build like mine that is converting through everything, then actually you should have a 20/15 one as soon as is practical. It's not always going to be practical for you, and in fact it's pure oversight on my behalf that my character in the Heist League does not have one, because it's only in Exile to buy a perfect one. Buying one that's got 15% elemental damage as extra chaos is usually 30 chaos on the first day of the league, 10 to 20 chaos on the second day, and then after that it's usually 5 to 10 chaos. Buying one with a perfect physical roll is usually only in the 5 to 10 chaos range the entire league. Anyway, that's all I've really got to say on Atziri's Promise. It's a fantastic flask, and it's a real introduction to the idea of using flasks as an offensive tool, rather than using them as a reactive life recovery tool or as a utility tool. Atziri's Promise is an item that you should pick up on most characters, unless you have a good reason not to. Pick one up when you can get it, typically about level 75, and don't get rid of it until you get something better. And the only things that generally are better are very expensive and very hard to source flasks, such as the Cinder Swallow Urn and the Bottled Faith. And ultimately, you can use more than one of these as well. There is nothing stopping you from using Atziri's Promise and Cinder Swallow Urn and the Bottled Faith all on the same character, and many characters should do that. Drop the number of life flasks you're using, drop the number of mana flasks, eliminate them entirely if you can. You may not be able to, and then you'll be able to go far doing a lot more damage by dedicating your flasks to offense instead of defense. That's all I got on this one. Comments and questions below. Otherwise, I will see you tomorrow for the big reveal of everything about the 3.13 expansion.